Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome CEO of Clean Fuels Alliance America, Donnell Rehagen.
All right. Hey, good morning. Good morning and welcome to the Clean Fuels Conference. And welcome back to beautiful San Diego. We know how much you all love it here, and if you're like me, if you're from the Midwest, you're really glad you're in San Diego this week. So it's a privilege to gather with you in Southern California. It's certainly a region that has been on our hearts and minds of so many in the recent weeks. The devastating wildfires in Los Angeles, just to our north, have given us such a stark reminder of the resilience and strength of community. So I'd like to take a moment, speaking of community, to recognize some of our longtime conference team, our production team, many of the guys that you see backstage, some of whom are from LA, and many of whom have been displaced from their homes by the wildfires. But their dedication is on fire. They are here with us today, and they wanted to make sure that our event runs smoothly, even in the face of their own personal challenges. And so to me, that's nothing short of remarkable. So if you wouldn't mind, please join me in giving them a heartfelt round of applause. So as we move forward together this week, let's carry on that same spirit of perseverance and community and support in everything that we do. So again, I want to thank all of you for being here. Now, I hope you enjoyed the opening reception last night, and I think it's very fitting for our industry and for us to gather here on such an historic day, January 20th. Now, that's one that brought millions of Americans together to watch, debate, maybe even shed a few tears of joy or frustration. And yes, I'm talking about the college football championship. Now, I'm a Notre Dame guy, so I have to take it, but congratulations to our friends from Ohio. Yes. So in all seriousness, we know we're hosting this year's event under some trying circumstances for many in our industry. And I want to thank you for remaining committed to supporting the Clean Fuels Conference, committed to learning, to connecting, and to growing, and committed to the clean fuels industry itself, supporting the growth of biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel. What we are doing is important, and it's reshaping our nation's energy and the environment. And remember, no one ever promised us this was going to be easy. But I, for one, know it is certainly worthwhile, and it's so rewarding. So I'd like to take just a minute to reflect on some of our milestones. We have several things that we should be proud of. This year's conference theme is Accelerate. And despite our trials, it's a fitting theme. And I'm proud to share that our U.S. fuel production in 2024 reached 5 billion gallons. Now, that's up almost 10% from last year. So this steep growth, particularly in renewable diesel, underscores our growing relevance. And get this, our clean fuels now constitute nearly 10% of the entire diesel fuel supply in the United States. And on top of that, our host state, California, is one of the single most important markets for our industry. Biodiesel and renewable diesel have displaced 75% of all diesel fuel sold in this state. It is now harder to find diesel fuel in California than our fuels. And our industry is responsible for over 45% of California's progress under the low carbon fuel standard so far. Now, we'll talk in more detail about this groundbreaking state policy and what it means for our fuels here on this stage shortly. We now have new market validation, accelerating from all directions. Last year, if you were with us at the conference, you heard from BNSF Railway. This year, I'm so pleased to announce that all 6 Class 1 railroads are now members of Clean Fuels Alliance. And tomorrow we'll hear from Union Pacific, another giant in the field. Rail embracing our fuels is just another example of our industry's credibility, our relevance, and our growing acceptance. And we've had an incredible decade of achievements. I want to reflect on the transformation from us at one time being skeptical that we could even be a 1 billion gallon industry. Today we see the remarkable accomplishments of 5 billion gallons. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the many pioneers who laid the foundation and made the industry what it is. Several of our past chairs are with us today, so let's give them a round of applause for their leadership and their vision. Now, I know I can't stand up here and just completely paint a rosy picture. We have our fair share of challenges. In fact, we often seem to find ourselves in challenging times as we launch our annual conference. And I know this year may seem especially challenging, but I believe we will pull through and at the end be even stronger. And I'm going to tell you why. I read a book recently, a book that I hope many of you have a chance to read on your own. And it's called The Mysterious Case of Rudolf Diesel: Genius, Power, and Deception on the Eve of World War I. Now, most of you know that Rudolf Diesel invented the diesel engine and that he designed his early versions of that engine to run on peanut oil. Because he was truly that visionary for renewable fuel, we choose to honor him by making the anniversary of his birthday, March 18th, National Biodiesel Day. And we registered that back in the early 2000s. But if you're like me, before I read this book, there's not much really more that you know about the man or the history of the engine's rise. Now, you might think that all of this is ancient history and that it couldn't possibly hold much relevance today. But let me tell you, this book is fascinating. I read it over the summer, and it reads like a Michael Connelly poolside thriller. And you know what they say about truth being stranger than fiction. Did you know that because of the new engine he invented, Rudolf Diesel was instrumental in changing the course of World War I and ultimately the fate of the world? So much so that the author, Douglas Brunt, places Diesel on the short list of the 4 most important figures in the Great War, right up there with Winston Churchill, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and John D. Rockefeller. Now let me read you just a short excerpt from the book and I'll let you see why I think this book spoke so much to me. In an industrial age, nothing moves without a motor. It is the beating heart of nations, and no inventor was more disruptive to the established order than Rudolf Diesel. The terrible irony is that Rudolf Diesel abhorred the societal evolutions that his engine wrought. He opposed economic centralization to urban centers. He despised global dependence on the oil monopolies, and he loathed mechanized warfare. His aim from the start had been to invent a compact and economical source of power to revitalize the artisan class and liberate the factory workers of the industrial age. He envisioned an engine that burned the natural resources that nearly all countries possessed, and he did so bidding the earth of smogging pollutants. So in fact, the story of Rudolf Diesel's effort to change the world is one of the most important of the 20th century. He didn't just support the use of vegetables and nut oil as a fuel, but he advocated for it fiercely. He wanted to break up the oil monopoly, through the flexibility of fuels. He wanted to support local economies. He wanted to give rural America a hand up. Sound familiar? His engine has endured and thrived for more than a century. Incredibly, the basic design concept hasn't changed hardly at all from what he unveiled in 1897. And I'm humbled by how much we can still learn from Rudolf Diesel and his resiliency. And here are my takeaways. First of all, much like Diesel was, our clean fuels are disruptors to the status quo. Rudolf Diesel didn't merely disrupt the status quo for the sake of innovation. He had a clear purpose. His engine was designed not just to revolutionize industry, but to empower local economies, to reduce dependence on monopolistic powers, and to create a cleaner, more equitable world. Likewise, today's clean fuels industry isn't about change for the sake of change. It's about creating a sustainable and inclusive energy future. Just like we face what feels like overwhelming obstacles at every turn, Diesel certainly felt the same way. Designing a new engine and getting people to change the way they think about power isn't all that easy. Yet he persisted and he changed the world for the better. Now, as I mentioned, January, more often than not, finds us facing what seems like insurmountable challenges that demand our persistence. This year feels different, and many of you have told me that. We've been waiting for critical guidance on the new 45Z tax credit, and the delays have already begun causing real hardships for our industry. Now, finally, just a little over a week ago, the Treasury released guidance. It left us with a few answers, but it's left us with a lot of questions. So now, more than ever, we need to stand united to ensure that this new administration prioritizes addressing those gaps and finalizing this rule sooner rather than later. Our feedstock producers, our fuel producers, they deserve clarity on how the tax credit will impact them. Patience will still be necessary, but persistence is going to be the key. Now let me take you back to January of 2019. I stood on a conference stage just like this one during the second year of a completely lapsed tax credit. That was an exceptionally tough time for many of us. But together we fought hard and we secured a 5-year tax credit, the longest and most stable period we've ever had, and a period of record growth for our industry. I know those 5 years seem to have passed by in the blink of an eye, but the point is this: things can and will turn around when we work together. So looking ahead, 2025 brings another major priority: the renewable volume obligations. The work has already begun to demonstrate our industry's potential to the EPA. What we call SET 2.0 will shape the next several years of fuel production. Those volumes were due last November, but the deadline was missed. This makes it all the more critical that we advocate for significant growth in those volumes and push this administration to finalize them soon, so we don't find ourselves this time next year without RVO levels for 2026. We have a passionate and very dedicated team of the finest staff and lobbying contractors working hard for you every day in Washington, D.C. And you're going to hear more from that team today and tomorrow. We also have many members of Congress who believe in us and are working hard for you too. And we have you, our members and our supporters. I have faith that you are doing everything that you can as well to share your impactful stories and make your voices heard, because after all, your voices matter the most. Resilience defines our industry. So back to what we can learn from our forefather, Rudolf Diesel. Just like him, we value clean air and environmental justice. Now, you may think EJ is a 21st century idea, but that's not so. Way back in the 18 and 1900s, Diesel believed in the rigors of capitalism, but he also stood for peace, equal opportunity, a clean environment, and humane working conditions in an era of rising exploitation. He believed that engineers had both a scientific and a social mandate. And today we see that spirit in our own society. Just like the rail industry, we continue to attract major corporations and others that have bold net zero commitments. No one is telling them they have to do this. They want to reduce carbon. They know it is the right thing to do, and they understand the role that they can play as corporate leaders. And here we are, as an industry, ready to help them meet that challenge. We see it at the state and the regional level as well, including ambitious commitments to reducing carbon in heating oil through bioheat fuel. Now, we recently visited New York City on a Clean Fuels Farmer Leader Tour. New York City has now reached its very, very ambitious goal of zero fossil fuels in its entire city fleet. Biodiesel and renewable diesel were instrumental in that. And that is a truly visionary, another example of what can be accomplished if you don't take no for an answer. Lastly, Rudolf Diesel championed the use of renewable resources for fuel. He believed that diversification of feedstock was powerful. Part of his vision for his technology was that it would be democratic. Artisans like his father, who toiled as a leather craftsman in Germany, would have access to localized power and machinery. He envisioned that any country or region could use the resources that they had for fuel. If your country could grow vegetables, you would have fuel. And this principle resonates strongly today as we explore diverse feedstocks to enhance energy resilience and sustainability. By championing this diversity, Diesel's vision continues to guide modern efforts to create flexible, inclusive, and sustainable energy solutions. In a 1912 visit to the United States, he's quoted as saying, "I can break the American fuel monopoly, and I don't need a law to do it." He knew he could do it with his revolutionary engine. Now, Diesel was, by this point, a worldwide celebrity. He traveled the world demonstrating his new engine and what it could accomplish. He rubbed elbows with kings and queens. Now, that might be hard for us to believe by today's celebrity standards, but it's true. His new technology was that revolutionary. And here's another quote from the newspapers back then. "I can run the whole American rail system on butter if you would kindly lend me the butter." Now, I think I know what Union Pacific might have to say about running its trains on butter, but the vision that Diesel had then about running the rail system on alternative fuel sources has come full circle. And you'll hear more about that during tomorrow morning's main stage session. Today, we have an interesting challenge as an industry. One, those involved in the early days of the clean fuels industry likely never envisioned: a need for more feedstock. We find ourselves trying to balance the push and pull of domestic and imported feedstock, products like soybean oil, canola oil, animal fats, and used cooking oil. Our industry's rapid growth, more than doubling production capacity in the last 4 years, has outpaced domestic feedstock availability, at least for now. By our calculations, current volumes of domestic feedstocks would support about 3.3 billion gallons of fuel production. And remember, we produced 5 billion gallons last year. As we've seen growing amounts of imported feedstocks coming in to fill the demand, it has generated angst between domestic feedstock growers and processors and fuel producers. And that is not ideal. The clean fuels industry was built in the early 1990s around the need to provide a large-scale consumer for excess domestic soybean oil. And therein was born biodiesel. Those back then would not have seen imported feedstocks as playing any role whatsoever. So while it may be hard to square this current dynamic with our original vision, imported feedstock has become necessary to meet the demand. And as someone who has been at this for over 20 years, I can't tell you how audacious the idea of an industry this size was to us back then. In the early 2000s, we struggled with whether our industry vision could suggest a 1 billion gallon industry. We thought we might get laughed out of the room. So what we are experiencing today are growing pains. So let's remember that while we struggle to find that right balance of imported and domestic feedstock to fill the need, we are at the same time enjoying record demand for our fuels. Feedstock balance. Feedstock balance is very important to our industry. Keep in mind, we are not the only consumers of the feedstocks we use. We must balance our growing need for more vegetable oils with the needs of the food and the feed industry. Waste feedstocks like cooking oil, distillers' corn oil, and animal fats play a very important role. The availability of those feedstocks, domestic and imported, allows our industry to not pull more than our fair share of vegetable oil feedstocks. The clean fuels industry has worked diligently for decades to ensure that it is never an issue of food versus fuel, but rather food and fuel. Growing volumes of domestic vegetable oils are just around the corner. The soybean crush industry has invested over $6 billion in the largest expansion of soybean crush in over 50 years. They have seen our industry grow, and they believe, like we do, that demand for clean, liquid, renewable fuels is now the new norm. They see our fuels have now reached a relevance worth investing in. This expansion of soybean crush is very important for the clean fuels industry as it brings significantly more feedstock to the table to support additional growth and production capacity of our fuels. Historically, U.S. processors have exported about 50% of our nation's whole beans, which sent a whole lot of soybean oil away as well. So now with this additional crush, and a 30% expansion, we can export fewer beans, and we can keep more of the oil. A NOPA analysis that looked at 2024 to 2030 shows this extra crush could provide us with up to 900 million gallons of additional soybean oil annually. And we all know soybean yields continue to climb. Now, I like the question, what if? A challenging question, what if? So what if we could increase crush by another 30%? Crush expansion becomes more important as Clean Fuels advocates for higher renewable volume obligations from the EPA. Stagnation in feedstock availability, domestic or imported, makes arguing for higher RVOs much more difficult. Now, you know the adage about a rising tide lifts all boats. Now, opinions on the proper role of imported feedstocks differ, and they are strong on both sides. Now, it has been suggested to me by some that the clean fuels industry may have grown too big for the good of domestic feedstock growers and processors. My response to that was and is that biodiesel and renewable diesel now make up 10% of the domestic diesel pool and 75% here in California. And that gives us a relevance like we've never had before. An enduring advancement to the American fuel supply rather than just a boutique blend stock. Now, those numbers matter. Those numbers matter to engine manufacturers who are making decisions. They matter to transportation industries like marine and rail as they decarbonize. Those numbers matter to commercial fleets. They matter to a growing bioheat industry that is pushing toward a goal of B40 by 2030. And I would argue this matters to domestic feedstock growers and processors as well. A growing clean fuels industry is good for everyone who plays any role in the supply chain of the feedstocks and the fuels. And it should be a source of pride, especially among the early industry leaders who fought so hard to get this off the ground. Soybean leaders like Gary Ellington, Mike McCraney, Jim Gay, Dick Prasher, David Womack. These soybean leaders fought to see this industry be able to make something out of itself. And now, here we are, producing 5 billion gallons a year. So let's give all those early leaders, and many more, some of who are here with us today, a round of applause. But we also have incredible innovation on the horizon. As I mentioned, Rudolph Diesel embraced capitalism at its finest. Where there is demand, the market will respond. In our case, we have the tangible soybean crush expansion underway, but we also have new oilseed opportunities, including cover crops. And we'll talk more about that during Thursday morning's closing breakfast, where we'll take a deep dive into feedstock innovations with top association leaders. And I can't wait to hear what their vision is. Whatever the future brings, I know 2025 will be an active and a challenging year, and we must remain unified. It's the main reason for our success. We have always managed to speak with one voice, even when getting to the right words was difficult. We will need engagement from this industry as the impacts of 45Z begin to take effect, and RVOs are set, all under a new administration. We're going to need everybody to participate. If we can win on these two things, 2025 and 2026 could be among our finest years yet. So how does our story end? Rudolph Diesel disappeared in 1913 on an overnight passenger ferry. On the deck of the ship, they found his neatly folded coat and hat. It was front page news around the world. So what really happened to him? Well, I won't dare spoil the ending for you, so you'll have to read the book to find out. But let me leave you with this thought. Rudolph Diesel's story reminds us that transformation doesn't happen overnight. His vision for an engine powered by renewable resources was a bold disruption to the status quo. And while he didn't live to see the full impact of his invention, his legacy lives on in all of us. Our industry, too, is built on bold ideas, unrelenting effort, and a shared belief in a cleaner, more sustainable future. We've grown from a niche concept into a relevant force that is reshaping our nation's energy landscape. Together, we've proven that innovation and resilience can drive real change. Yes, we face challenges, but challenges are also opportunities. Opportunities for creativity, operations for collaboration, opportunities for determination. So as we gather here this week, let's recommit ourselves to the values that brought us here. We can write our own next chapter. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Clean Fuels Director of State Regulatory Affairs, Corey Ann Wynn.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the West Coast. So it's my privilege this morning to introduce to you a visionary leader in environmental policy. It's Dr. Stephen Cliff, Executive Officer of the California Air Resources Board. So Dr. Cliff was appointed to as Executive Officer in 2022. And he, with there at the California Air Resources Board, leads about 2,000 employees that create and implement programs to reduce air and climate pollution. Dr. Cliff has extensive scientific and regulatory experience and was the most recently the 16th administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and prior to that, served as CARB's Deputy Executive Officer overseeing its climate programs. So most notable for me and for this audience is the program that is the Low Carbon Fuel Standard. the transformational impact it has had on our industry and on the world. So over 15 years now, CARB has been the ultimate ambassador of the LCFS by leading the development of the policy, by creating an entirely new market for low carbon transportation fuels, and then sharing it with the rest of the United States and beyond. Without CARB's leadership, there would not be an Oregon Clean Fuels Program. There would not be a Washington Clean Fuel Standard, nor a New Mexico Clean Transportation Fuel Standard, or any other future such programs. So please join me this morning in thanking CARB for being an ally to the clean fuels industry and in welcoming Dr. Cliff to the stage.
Thank you. Good morning. It's great to be here. Wow, look at this full house. Amazing. Thanks very much, Corianne and Donnell, for that wonderful opening, and to the Clean Fuels Alliance America for inviting me to speak today. So I am Steve Cliff. I'm from CARB, and CARB is California's Climate and Clean Air Agency. You probably all know that. You know who we are. Some people love us, some people hate us. But anyway, this is the organization that I lead, about 2,200 staff now. Just to give you a sense of what that means, when I started 16 years ago, and I've been there in various places, as you heard, we were under 1,000 staff. So it's grown significantly as our climate program has grown. So I want to talk a little bit today about our programs. But first, I just want to say, because I know there's a lot of uncertainty out there, and want to be very clear that we're looking to partner with all of you, with the federal government, with other states, but we're also taking steps to defend our clean air, climate, and environmental protections against the expected rollbacks of this new administration. I don't want to be in an adversarial position. I just want to make clear that we're here to defend the programs that benefit Californians, and other states that take advantage of our programs also benefit the residents of their states. And you may have heard that the California legislature is working to set up additional funds to shore up state and local defenses against this new administration. We're hoping that that's not necessary, but we are working to make sure that our programs can stay in perpetuity. And as a reminder, we prevailed in the lawsuits during the first Trump administration because they're founded on science and on good legal premises. So we believe that we'll continue to prevail, and that's important because that provides certainty to those of you who are investing in California and investing in the programs. We want to make sure that those investments are done knowing that these programs will stay in place. And that's the type of work that we continue to do to make sure that the foundational parts of our efforts are very sound. We're also preparing with a list of priorities for this year, and I'm going to unveil more of those at our board meeting this Thursday, so I won't give you too much of that. I will just say that we know we've got to keep the momentum for private investment in clean energy and technology as the federal administration implements policies. We've got to keep that investment going here. So one of our key programs that supports public health and addresses climate change is the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, or LCFS. All of you probably know a lot about this, but just a little over 2 months ago, my board approved amendments to the LCFS, and it's this important program paired with CARB's past action on zero-emission vehicle regulations and approaches to reduce increasing demand for driving to reduce transportation sector emissions that forms the basis of California's transportation decarbonization strategy. And I'm pleased to be here to give you an update on how that's progressing. So behind me, you see this slide. It's titled AB 32, Sources at a Level of Significance. That phrase comes directly from Assembly Bill 32, which is the foundational climate law for California's work. And as you can see, the data clearly show that transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas and criteria pollution emissions here in California. When you consider oil extraction and refining, transportation accounts for about half of greenhouse gas emissions, 40% of particulate matter, and 60% of oxides of nitrogen in California. And despite all the progress that California and we at CARB have made over the past 50 years, about half of Californians still breathe unhealthy air. The transportation sector is the biggest single culprit of air and climate pollution in California. We've demonstrated, after almost 2 decades of programs under AB 32, that we can have both greenhouse gas emission reductions and grow our economy. And in that time, we've actually grown the economy of California to be the 5th largest in the world if you considered California alone. And while we achieved the 2020 emissions reduction target that was laid out in AB 32 years ahead of schedule, we've got a lot more to do to continue emission reductions, to do our part, and show others how this work can be accomplished. In 2022, the legislature passed what's called AB 1279, and that requires California to achieve carbon neutrality and reduce emissions by 2045, 85% below 1990 levels. So carbon neutrality and 85% emissions reduction, which will also need to require that we do carbon sequestration. So we have other requirements for greenhouse gas emission reductions in 2030 and requirements under federal law that we achieve the national ambient air quality standards that have been developed by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. To help meet California's legislative requirements, CARB has moved forward on an ambitious air quality and climate change portfolio. This climate change policy portfolio is comprised of a mix of regulations, incentives, and carbon pricing. These include an economy-wide carbon price via the cap and trade program, requirements to reduce the carbon intensity of transportation fuels via the low carbon fuel standard that I previously mentioned, renewable energy requirements under the renewable portfolio standard, zero emission vehicle requirements under both what's called advanced clean cars and the advanced clean trucks regulations, building energy efficiency and electrification in buildings to improve the energy code and ensure that we reduce emissions from the housing and commercial sectors, building sectors, reductions in short-lived climate pollutants via oil and gas, that is methane, HFC, and landfill methane regulations. And state strategies for working lands. We can't forget the natural and working land sectors. We also are trying to decarbonize cement, do carbon capture and sequestration, and develop low carbon hydrogen. These climate programs are all guided by the in-depth planning conducted at CARB through that scoping plan process. And our most recent scoping plan, which was approved in December of 2022, calls for a 94% reduction in petroleum use by 2045 to meet that carbon neutrality target. And it lays a path to achieve carbon neutrality by that time, all while growing the economy and improving public health. That most recent scoping plan, it's the most ambitious scoping plan ever, and it identified the important role of clean fuels and zero-emission technologies that will play in drastically reducing emissions to achieve that target in the coming decades. Now, we've seen over the past decade how California's innovative regulations, like the Renewables Portfolio Standard, LCFS, and the Cap and Trade Program, can create a market to help shift to lower carbon energy. For example, a result of the LCFS, we've seen billions in credit revenue and private investment in the build-out of zero-emission vehicle technologies, the expansion of renewable and biomass diesel to displace fossil diesel. You heard it earlier, 75% of our fossil diesel has been replaced with bio and renewable resources. And the growth of biomethane capture facilities in California and across the nation, investment in clean hydrogen production, expansion of zero-emission transit, and much, much more. And additionally, we've seen how this investment can ultimately keep money in California and in Californians' pockets through increasing consumer choices, which drive transportation fuel price competition, growing new industries and attracting investments that support jobs and strengthen communities, reducing dependence on petroleum, the oil industry, and thereby protecting consumers from the volatility associated with that industry, making electric vehicles more affordable, expanding access to electric vehicle charging and hydrogen refueling infrastructure, reducing healthcare costs associated with air pollution from these emissions, and just recently, the governor directed us to promulgate regulations towards allowing E15 in California, which will further reduce fuel costs and help diversify the fuel supply in California, bringing more clean fuels to market. And so it's with the backdrop of this decades-plus successful low-carbon fuel standard policy combined with a clear call by the legislature and my board to be more ambitious that staff initiated regulatory updates to the low-carbon fuel standard in 2023. The CARB staff spent 2 years and conducted extensive stakeholder engagement and provided unparalleled transparency as part of that rulemaking process. And of course, we received substantial comments, in fact, thousands of them, all of which staff had to respond to throughout that process in finalizing the regulation. And so what were some of the key themes that came from this intensive regulatory update process? First, and most importantly, we recognize that there's a clear need to increase the stringency of the low-carbon fuel standard and help accelerate decarbonization. Without regulatory updates, the current LCFS would have targeted 20% reduction in carbon intensity in 2030 and stayed at that level in perpetuity. Instead, our analysis showed that maintaining that existing regulatory stringency would stifle future investments. It would risk stranding assets in clean fuel production and could leave important greenhouse gas reductions and criteria pollutant benefits on the table. We also recognized that the transition to zero-emission vehicles will not happen overnight, and that we're going to need to have affordable and clean low-carbon liquid fuels like renewable diesel, biodiesel, ethanol, biomethane, and others to help achieve near-term greenhouse gas reductions and air quality benefits to move away from fossil fuels. We also clearly stated that additional methane reductions are necessary for California and that low-carbon fuel standard needs to continue to support the build-out of digesters in California and beyond, particularly in this decade. But given the significant public feedback we received, the staff conducted many workshops over several years and comments from our board members. We also recognize that biofuel use is not risk-free, and that concern about land use impacts of biofuel production, the impacts on food systems, and other environmental impacts of biofuel production, that we had to balance and work together with industry those risks with what's necessary in order to reduce emissions. So we saw an opportunity for the low-carbon fuel standard to help support multiple policy priorities. For instance, by accelerating fast charging and hydrogen refueling infrastructure deployment and helping to reduce emissions from hard to decarbonize sectors like aviation and marine. Those things could work together. We released extensive technical analysis showing that removing decarbonization options like CCS and direct air capture would result in more greenhouse gas emissions, worse air quality, and higher costs than keeping those options for the program. So on November 8 last year, in a significant win for our climate and for air quality and the clean energy industry, the board approved our proposed updates to the low-carbon fuel standard after a marathon all-day public meeting. And believe me, it was a long one. If any of you watched it, you know. The approved regulatory changes set the stage for billions more in clean fuel investments in the coming decades. More specifically, the approved regulatory updates increase the program's stringency by changing the 2030 targets to reduce that carbon intensity of California's transportation and fuel pool from 20% to 30%, and set an ambitious 2045 carbon intensity target. As I mentioned, it would have otherwise stayed flat. It includes a new auto acceleration mechanism that will help keep that clean energy development momentum going. The amendments open up significant new opportunities for biofuels and zero-emission vehicle infrastructure for medium and heavy-duty vehicles and transit. They also introduced new sustainability guardrails to avoid potential future land use changes associated with crop-based biofuels. But they stopped short of explicitly capping biofuel despite the many, many calls from environmental and EJ communities to do so. The amendments did not immediately end crediting for biomethane projects and instead provided greater certainty for avoided methane crediting and methane capture going forward. We also made changes to strengthen the equity provisions and increased opportunities to promote investment in disadvantaged communities and rural communities. And as part of all this, we were able to strike an agreement with the airline industry to ensure that at least 200 million gallons of cost-competitive sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, is available for use by airlines within California by 2035. Ultimately, the adopted regulation reflected a clear balance between reducing the environmental and health impacts of transportation fuel used in California and ensuring that low-carbon options are available as the state continues to work towards a zero-emission future. It's a win-win for California. It will increase consumer options beyond petroleum, giving consumers more choices and lowering cost fueling options. And it provides a roadmap and a path for cleaner fuel and leverages private sector investment and federal incentives to spur innovation to address climate change and reduce pollution. Yet the work is far from over. Climate action deniers are persistent, and they would slow the progress of decarbonizing our transportation system and lock us into the energy infrastructure of the past, via attacks on specific programs or CARB more broadly. We have no plans to slow down, and we're prepared to defend our critical clean air regulations and our initiatives as necessary. As an agency, we're ready and committed to building that clean air future and decarbonize the transportation fuel pool, continue with CARB's mission to work towards generating positive results for all California communities. And for LCFS more specifically, we must now navigate multiple lawsuits on the rulemaking from both advocates and from industry this year, and assuming we prevail and we receive OAL, the Office of Administrative Law, approval in the coming months, we can begin that real work of implementing the updated regulatory provisions later this year. We also have a number of follow-up actions to do in response to the board direction to staff. That includes establishing a sustainable aviation fuel work group, holding a convening on land use change, increasing the transparency around program outcomes. And while these aren't imminent, we do look forward to making progress on all of these later in 2025. Science, facts, and most importantly, momentum is on our side. With CARB's actions on clean vehicles, with the past successes of our climate policies, with already established investments from federal funds, and most importantly, partnerships with willing and supportive government agencies and the private sector, advocacy groups, and the public, we will continue driving toward a cleaner and healthier future. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cliff. Again, please give him a round of applause. You know, we as the clean fuels industry are excited to be partners with CARB in their effort to decarbonize the entire economy of the state of California. As I mentioned earlier, we are playing a very, very significant role already. So again, thanks Dr. Cliff for being here. Next up, we'll continue to shine that spotlight on our host state, California, where, as you've heard, clean fuels like biodiesel and renewable diesel make up an astounding 75% of the state's diesel pool. So thanks to California's pioneering low-carbon fuel standard, Dr. Cliff just spoke about, the demand for clean fuels has accelerated to heights across all markets, although the journey hasn't been without its challenges. Our esteemed panel this morning will explore the current landscape of clean fuels and what the market holds for this influential state. So let's meet our panel. First up, Harry Simpson. Harry is the co-founder and president and CEO of Crimson Renewable Energy Holdings, the largest producer of biodiesel in California. Harry has led Crimson through multiple plant construction and expansion projects, business development, and the acquisition and sale of biodiesel and used cooking oil assets. Harry has served on the governing board of Clean Fuels Alliance America since 2017. And since 2010 on the board of the California Advanced Biofuels Alliance. So please welcome Harry Simpson. Thanks. Now next to join us is Richard Battersby. Richard's the Assistant Director of Public Works Agency for the City of Oakland, California. Richard has over 30 years of experience in the fleet industry as a fleet manager and in other roles, and has almost just as much history with alternative fuels. He serves as the director of the East Bay Clean Cities Coalition of Oakland, a coalition he first joined in 1998. So you could certainly call him an early adopter. His list of accomplishments in the alternative fuel industry is too long to mention, so let me just share Richard is in both the DOE Clean Cities and Public Fleet Manager Halls of Fame, most recently receiving the Benjamin Watson Inspirational Award from the Clean Cities Coalition Council. So please give a warm welcome to Richard Battersby. Welcome. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from our next panelist, who seems to think and act once in a while like he's retired. So when you think about the success of clean fuels in California, this person's name almost always comes to mind. He spent more than 30 years at CARB, including as chief of the Industrial Strategies Division. He also led the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee for 2 years. During his illustrious career at CARB, he oversaw key climate change and air quality programs, including the groundbreaking low-carbon fuel standard. He then finished his illustrious career with us, serving as Director of State Governmental Affairs for Clean Fuels until 2023. So you know who I'm talking about. Please welcome Floyd Vergara.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce your moderator. Carlos Gutierrez is Executive Director of the California Advanced Biofuels Alliance. CABA is the leading trade association committed to promoting the development and use of biofuels across California. Under Carlos' leadership, CABA advocates for biodiesel and renewable diesel producers and manufacturers, supporting policies that establish California as the market leader in biofuels. He also serves as a governmental advocate at Con Suarez and Conway, representing a diverse clientele in the California State Legislature. So please welcome Carlos Gutierrez. Thank you. Carlos, I'm going to leave this panel in your very, very capable hands, and I'm looking really forward to this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you, Donnell. Thank you for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Gentlemen, I look forward to our discussion today. There's a lot of topics we need to cover, not a whole lot of time, so let's go ahead and get into it. We heard from Dr. Cliff from CARB. You know, California considers this leader in climate policy and the regulatory side. He mentioned the low-carbon fuel standard. On November 8th, a big vote happened, and there were some changes made to the regulation. Just wanted to start off the conversation and ask you, gentlemen, what are your thoughts from the November 8th and any comments from Dr. Cliff?
I can start. Thank you for having me here. It's always great to see everyone. I really appreciate Dr. Cliff's comments. Just to provide you some background, CARB doesn't come to these conferences very often, so props to Dr. Cliff for coming here and providing his comments. I really appreciated the comments with respect to the importance of science, the importance of collaboration and partnership, and I think that goes, that works well with the, partnership with clean fuels industry, particularly in this coming year, where we hope to work closely with staff to update the indirect land use change science and help inform some of the things that came out of that. I don't want to take up too much time. I'll start with that.
Harry, you're a biodiesel producer in California. I'd like to know what your thoughts are.
Sure. I would echo what Floyd said. We certainly appreciate CARB's engagement. I mean, I've been going to CARB workshops on LCFS since, I think, '09. We formed this state trade association, today's California Advanced Biofuels Alliance, back in 10, 11. And CARB's consistently engaged with industry representatives even before CFA got involved when it was the National Biodiesel Board. So I appreciate that. I do also appreciate this latest rulemaking. It was a long time coming. And as Floyd said, I think we appreciate the focus on science. That said, I think they still get some things wrong from my perspective as a California biodiesel producer, from my perspective as a board member of both the state and national trade associations, where I think they don't necessarily get the science quite right or apply it as comprehensively as they could.
Richard, you're a local guy in the East Bay, Oakland. You manage the fleets, use our fuels. Of course, this is going to impact you and how you manage the fleets in Oakland. What are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said previously, and having worked in California for the last 30 years, specifically in fleet and focusing in alternative fuels, we all know that there's two certainties in life, death and taxes. I'll say the third certainty is out there too, it's regulation. But having the parties involved that are open and receptive and having that dialogue helps us all work together because there is, as noted, some room for improvement in the regulation. But I really appreciate Dr. Cliff coming out here and sharing his thoughts and making the staff available to hear our input and consider that for this and future regulations.
Of course. Now, we talked about improvements. Does anyone want to expand on what kind of improvements, especially you, Richard, since you're using the fuel?
Sure. From the fleet side, a lot of folks in the room probably already are aware, the Advanced Clean Fleet Rule is focusing heavily on zero-emission vehicles, electric and hydrogen, to help the state meet its emission reduction goals. And this is happening to the exclusion of existing biofuels and renewable fuels that, if incorporated into that regulation, the full portfolio of available options, we feel, Clean Cities, and I think a lot of folks do, we could achieve those or attain those goals much sooner.
Okay.
So a couple of things to say is, to CARB's credit, they've always shown the willingness and the ability to take a second look at a program, and see the landscape that they're currently facing and make adjustments when needed. Either to address market changes, demand, or even the science. So I'll give them credit for that. I really appreciate that. I think that's going to play well with our efforts moving forward. The LCFS rulemaking, I think, got a number of things right. The aggressive CI targets, I think, really needed to be put in place. The step down that's going to take effect immediately. Both of those things provide that immediate remedy for the softening of the credit prices that was much needed to continue to send that strong market signal. And then they did what was really unusual for the agency, which is to establish a very long time frame for this program out through 2045 and beyond. As you heard Dr. Cliff say, in the previous iteration, they had only gone to 2030, and then it would flatline past that. So really, it's a great way to send that certainty, that strong market signal that California really wants their low-carbon fuels coming or into the state or being produced in the state. That was a really good thing. The auto acceleration mechanism, I think, was an innovative response to the need for a program like this to be much more nimble and responsive to changing market dynamics. As we saw in the past couple of years, there was a softening of credit prices, and normally when you go through and try to make adjustments to these programs, you have to go through a lengthy, I think you heard him say, a 2-year process for this latest rulemaking. Lengthy, somewhat cumbersome rulemaking process. The auto acceleration mechanism allows for the program to respond much more quickly when certain specified conditions are met, and then that mechanism accelerates the compliance targets by 1 year, thereby addressing any potential future softening of credit prices. So I think those two things are really good outcomes for the program. As Harry mentioned, I think there's still a lot of work to be done to improve the science that was the basis for a number of outcomes from the rulemaking, in particular the cap on certain feedstocks as well as the sustainability provisions. But I'm confident we'll be able to work with the staff to update that science. I know the science is in our corner. I feel pretty strong about that, and I'm really glad to hear their willingness to work with the industry and partner. Because I think at the end of the day, the state realizes, and you heard Dr. Cliff say, there's still a strong role for low-carbon fuels like biodiesel and renewable diesel and SAF to play both in the near and long term in California, while the state is aggressively trying to electrify everything they can. And more power to them, pardon the pun. They really do need to achieve that in order to get the aggressive carbon neutrality targets and things like that. So I don't see it as Donnell said. I don't see it as an either or. I think you need all of the tools in the toolkit to achieve those really aggressive targets. So I'm looking forward to that partnership.
Harry, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I would certainly echo what Floyd said about all the things that this latest rulemaking got right. I think back to 2009-10 when the first carbon targets were set for a 10% reduction in 2020, and then they came out with sort of V2 and set targets for 2030, and we blew past those, right? The need for that step down was evidenced in the marketplace by quarter on quarter, every quarter, for over 2 years now, where the credit generation exceeds the credits that were obligated under those carbon targets, those carbon reduction targets. So this is a hugely, hugely successful program that is, frankly, beaten down all the naysayers in terms of what was achievable. And that 9% step down was really addressing the reality in the marketplace of how much credit generation is taking place. On the science, if I think about crop-based biofuels, CARB needs to update the science, right? We're still using the same ILUC factor from 2014 that is now over 10 years old. It doesn't match up with, if you look at Argonne GREET and what Argonne GREET's using, ILUC, by the way, is indirect land use change. And looking at that and looking at the carbon score that you would get under other GREET models with more updated land use data. So I think that's one example of where the science needs to get caught up. Speaking about crop-based biofuels, I know for this audience, that's for several of you a topic that's near and dear to their heart. My plant, just full disclosure, we've used very little crop-based biofuels. We only used a little bit for the first time last year to establish our pathways under the new GREET modeling. But that's not to say I don't believe that crop-based biofuels play an important role and could play an increasing role in California in terms of the biofuels that are coming into California. But to put a cap on it, if the problem is deforestation, if that's the real concern, you know, the deforestation, if you think of it as being driven by demand for food, for biofuels, specifically as it relates to oilseed crops, and planting more soybean for the protein market, right, for beef as for cattle feed. That's not happening in North America, right? You could be much more targeted in trying to address that problem if you think that's a problem, you being CARB, and you could perhaps put caps where probably they need to be, which is, for example, soybean oil or virgin vegetable oils out of those sensitive parts of the world where deforestation is a problem. South America, Southeast Asia, for example. To put it on North American crop-based fuels, you're not solving anything if that's the problem. You know, I can go down a long list of things that I think CARB, I think could have done better. You know, Floyd mentioned sustainability. They brought up some pretty general language. You know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but as a fuel producer, if you want to put sustainability requirements, one, I'm very concerned that they wouldn't dovetail what already exists and what's being worked on federally under the renewable fuel standard, right? We don't want kind of two different sets of requirements, and, you know, if CARB's approach is to bring in sort of an EU-driven sustainability requirement regime, you know, that becomes, that's certainly not where things are going federally, and that becomes very problematic for industry to try to comply with. RNG, I don't know how far you want me to go. I feel there's definitely some missed opportunities as it relates to RNG. You know, I think about RNG, California's invested a huge amount of state funding to really do what needed to be done, for example, with dairy digesters. And it's been very successful. If today you look at the amount of fuel that is consumed for vehicles that can burn natural gas, it's almost all renewable. But what I don't understand is why California needs to incentivize RNG production outside of California. It doesn't bring any economic benefit. It doesn't bring any emissions benefit to California per se. You know, RNG in Wisconsin, being able to claim a credit in California, maybe in the early days where there was some concern about whether there's going to be enough credits and you wanted another source of credit generation, or you wanted, you know, California is like a guiding light, right? A lot of states copy California's regulation, and California wanted to get that on the table. That made sense 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Today, from a market perspective, we don't need that credit generation. You know, it doesn't help California, it doesn't create any economic benefit to California for RNG to be generating credits, RNG in Wisconsin or pick a state outside of California to generate California carbon credits. You'd be better off, for example, from a California perspective, right, to allow, you know, biodiesel or renewable diesel going into marine, even if that is for vessels within the 250-mile limit within the coast of California burning it, or going offshore. You'd be better off seeing that fuel go into marine and allow marine to be an opt-in if you want that volume of credits to stay in the system, rather than to have it come from out-of-state RNG.
Can I follow up real quick to
Absolutely.
Something Harry mentioned? And I think it's important to put some numbers to these points, and I think Harry brought up some really good points. So for our farmer members out in the audience, I think you're going to play a really important role moving forward. I mean, you have played an important role till now, but I think in terms of providing the education and information to update some of the science, I think it's going to be key to working with the state on this issue, not just for California, but for all the other states that have an LCFS or are considering these sort of programs. Just to put some numbers on to why we believe the science needs to be updated. So back in the, pre-LCFS 2009, 2008, the early estimates of indirect land use change for soy was upwards of 300 grams per megajoule CI. And just to give you a sense of perspective, the total CI for petroleum diesel is around 100. So early estimates were 3 times or more of that. Fast forward a couple of years, the science has started to firm up, provided input into the modeling. That number has gone down to 60. A few years after that, CARB adopts the current value for indirect land use change for soy down to 29.1. So you've gone from 300 to 29.1. That's a 90% reduction in the span of a few years. The latest work by Purdue, which is the author and the implementer of the ILUC model, GTAP, Global Trade Analysis Project, their latest estimate from 2023 indicates that the ILUC for soy is actually closer to less than 10. So you're going from 300 to 10. And the interesting part about that is it's 1/3 of CARB's current value at 4 times the volume of, 4 times the shock volume that's used in the modeling. So I think there's a critical need to update the science. CARB didn't have the opportunity to do that with this rulemaking. I really, truly believe that, the GTAP is the ILUC modeling that's hardwired into the regulation. There really does need to be a revisit and updating of that as a very first threshold step before we can take steps in order to address, I think, what are legitimate concerns from CARB, which is deforestation and other things like that. But addressing it with misinformed data, I think, is erroneous. And I think that's something that needs to be worked on.
Of course, so we've covered some of the good, some of the not so good, and of course I think there's a third element that we need to take into consideration when we talk about CARB and California regulatory process, and that's the environmental justice groups who have a significant impact in rulemaking, and of course their voice that is heard at these meetings. They have stories to tell from different areas and facilities. So Richard, I want to pivot to you. I know you have some information that you want to share. Can you talk a little bit about your work with the ports of Oakland, the environmental justice groups, and how perhaps we can better work with those groups to kind of move in the same direction instead of always being on the opposite ends of things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've all acknowledged that coming from the highest level, especially federal, there's been a focus on providing resources to disadvantaged communities through environmental justice. You probably heard of the EJ40. So being part of East Bay Clean Cities Coalition, we're basically a grassroots arm of Federal Department of Energy. We actually work on vehicle deployments with fuel providers, fuel refiners, fleets. We actually have specific projects that are reaching out into disadvantaged communities that also will incorporate biofuels. You mentioned the Port of Oakland. We're doing a couple of studies right now to develop a freight corridor between the Port of Oakland and the Port of Sacramento. Of course, it's focused on battery electric. That's sort of where all the interest is. You got environmental justice, battery electric, hydrogen. But the reality is that that data is going to inform the travel of currently diesel-powered vehicles, and they can just as easily, or maybe are right now, powered by biofuels, renewable diesel and biodiesel. Can I get you to pop the slide? Slide number 51? Oh, it's up. All right, great. This is an example indicating the success, I think, of the low-carbon fuel standard. It shows the fuel displacement, petroleum fuel displacement in the East Bay region from 2015 to 2024. And so that's like the last 10 years. And it's just showing a tremendous shift in biofuel use, in great part due to the low-carbon fuel standard. 2015, I see as the genesis of this revolution. That's when renewable diesel became widely available to fleets in the area. It had been blended into the state petroleum diesel supply since 2010 at its inception, but we started getting the bulk deliveries available. And you can see now the renewable and biodiesel is the predominant alternative fuel use in the East Bay, and I think that's indicative of the rest of California. And I probably should have made this a 3-pie chart slide. Prior to 2015, the predominant alternative fuel was compressed natural gas, and it had been that way since the late 90s. If you're wondering, Clean Cities, we're not an environmental program. We're actually focused on displacing petroleum consumption, and that's for the economic and energy security of our nation, but then also environmental. We noticed a nice little side benefit as we're replacing petroleum, diesel, and gasoline with these alternative fuels. There's a very significant emission reduction, and so that sort of dovetailed right into CARB as it evolved. I used to work for the state, so I've been around for a while, and I think it's really dramatic to see that shift here in California, and I think it demonstrates low carbon fuel standards in other states. You can experience a similar success, and then you will see these volumes go up where at one point we're going to be looking at feedstock limitations. So it's really cool to be here in the group with crop fuel providers or crop-based fuel providers and suppliers, because primarily we've been using renewable and bio that are produced from waste. So getting back to your point, we do see a lot of emphasis, and when I say emphasis, I mean grant funding, coming along for projects that are going to deploy in economically and environmental disadvantaged communities, and there are opportunities. There's Clean Cities Coalition throughout the nation, not just here in California. That's probably your best way to get introduced to that particular arena if you're so inclined.
Oh, go ahead, Floyd.
So just to add to what Richard just said, I want to make sure everyone, for those who are not familiar with the term environmental justice, I want to be absolutely clear. This is a critical issue for both California and a number of states. And this is not one of these flavor of the month sort of things. It is, these are real issues involving people who tend to be in low to moderate income, categories. And the important thing is, though their communities tend to be co-located or very close to and impacted by high pollution sites, ports, rail yards, logistics facilities, those sort of things. If any of you have ever gone to Los Angeles, I invite you to go to the Port of LA or Port of Long Beach, and you'll see a stark example of what I'm talking about. You'll see a huge port, lots of ships coming in, a mile-long line of trucks idling through neighborhoods to get to the port. And then it's surrounded by a number of ports like Wilmington and other communities like that. So this is a real critical health issue for them. I think this is an important thing where we can emphasize the role that both electrification and liquid biomass-based diesel can play. Electrification, of course, is important for the state to pursue. There's some challenges with the costs and the infrastructure and other sort of things like that naturally keep the adoption rates at a certain level. The important role that liquid biomass-based diesel plays is that it's available now. There's no infrastructure challenges. You don't need to change your vehicles, and it's at a price advantage or price parity with diesel. And that immediacy of the availability of these fuels benefits environmental justice and disadvantaged communities, because you can get those fuels into the trucks that need them, especially the older vehicles that could provide the greatest emission benefits, and those will provide immediate benefits to the surrounding environmental justice community. So wanted to be sure everyone understands the role that environmental justice plays in informing the decisions that CARB and other states make.
And Floyd, I think that's a good segue into, I think you have some slides to go over with some studies.
Oh, yeah,
air
I
quality.
do happen to have slides to elaborate on that.
Surprise.
All right, so, this is not a remake of Dante's Inferno. This is actually a picture of Los Angeles a couple of weeks ago. And just to give you a sense of how dire the climate issue is in California and how that's going to continue to drive the programs like LCFS. This is sort of what we're talking about here. The next two slides are from the Trinity study, which Clean Fuels commissioned a couple of years ago. And basically, it looked at, I think, 28 different high diesel use sites, ports, logistics, freight corridors, things like that, as well as the heating sector, and basically asked the simple question: if you took the petroleum diesel at those sites and switched them with 100% biodiesel, what would the outcome look like with respect to the community surrounding that? And so this is for West Oakland, for my colleague here. The red shows the elevated cancer risks, and you could see that switch over to biodiesel in the older vehicles, and there's still quite a lot of them out there, would provide an immediate benefit in terms of cancer reductions and non-cancer impacts with respect to premature deaths avoided, asthma cases reduced, and so forth. So those are substantial, especially around the ports. We did the analysis for California specifically. I can't read that from here, but about $2 billion worth of avoided health costs, thousands and thousands of asthma cases per year reduced, sick days reduced. And then on a national level, for those 28, just for the 28 sites that we looked at, I think it amounted to about $7.5 billion per year of avoided health costs. So it gives you a sense of the need to provide both an and solution, right? So electrification as states move forward, but in the meantime, through that period, through the many years that it's going to take to electrify the very difficult to electrify sectors like marine, rail, heavy-duty on-road, aviation, and the heating sectors, you can continue to get very substantial health benefits through the use of currently available liquid biomass-based diesels. These give you some stark numbers to just provide you with an estimate of what those would look like. And so I invite, I know the Groundwork Elizabeth folks from New Jersey are here. We partnered with them. I invite other folks who may be engaged with the environmental justice communities to get this information out to them, work with Clean Fuels, because we're happy to provide and share this information with those folks.
Great. So we've talked a whole lot about a bunch of little things, and we can't really dive into all of them. So hopefully these folks will be available after the panel. But we talked about the issues with the crop-based cap, the sustainability. There's obviously going to be room for us to continue to engage with CARB, to be at the table to have those conversations, to see how that's going to play out. We've talked about the environmental justice groups, their impacts on California. We talked about, Richard, how you work with these fleets and how it's applicable. The question I have at the end here is, what's next? What do we think is going to happen in the next year, 2 years, 5 years? Just real quick. Whoever wants to start.
Well, I'll throw something out there. I mean, I think CARB really needs to think about what's going on, outside of the program that directly impacts the program. I mean, if I look at 45Z, the new tax credit mechanism, which has really now moved to a LCFS type carbon approach being applied to the tax credit, it heavily incentivizes waste-based biofuels. It gets the best carbon score, the most tax credit. That's always been the case in California, but now it's writ large on a national level for the entire national biomass-based diesel supply, as well as sustainable aviation fuel. Meanwhile, CARB has put a 20% cap on crop-based fuels that's going to take effect starting in 28. As a producer, I'm concerned about feedstock availability. I also think about, from your perspective, Richard, we have the Advanced Fuel Technology Program that CARB is pushing OEMs to make ZEV, zero-emission vehicle for the heavy-duty and medium-duty diesel sector. Kind of hand in hand with that, you have the Advanced Clean Fuels Program, which is to essentially force fleet operators to buy these new advanced clean technology diesel replacement engines. But you need a waiver from EPA for that, which CARB withdrew that waiver, or California withdrew that waiver request recently from US EPA, which means they're going to need biomass-based diesel for a long time. And you can already see, obviously, the emission benefits. It's a cleaner burning fuel. The carbon reduction is massive. It's the leading generator of carbon credits. Biomass-based diesel is almost half the carbon credits being generated. But if you're going to handcuff us and limit the types of feedstocks in a way that isn't necessarily rational relative to the stated goals, like I said, if your concern is deforestation, then let's talk about a cap on Brazilian soybean oil or Argentine soybean oil or, any kind of palm-based product has always been a problem in California, but let's be a little more rational. I'm very concerned about just what it's doing to the pool of feedstock and how we're going to help California achieve the goals and even just to maintain what's already been achieved.
Richard, thoughts?
Yep, Harry hit the nail on the head. To keep the momentum going, obviously there needs to be some incentives, and to be successful, incentives have to be predictable and they have to be consistent, and that lets folks invest in that area. And I think missteps along the way, some of the caps need to be course correct and adjust as we move forward. And right now we're 1 year into the Advanced Clean Fleet rule that mandates fleets to procure zero-emission, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles. I don't have the slide up yet for 2025, but the uptick is disappointing. If you looked at that pie chart closely, you'd have to look real close to see the battery electric and the hydrogen throughput, because right now, 96, 97% of alternative fuel use in our area is either biofuels or natural gas, primarily renewable natural gas, to your point, Harry. So those fuels will continue to be needed, and I'm going to predict the Air Resources Board is going to have to come back to the table with some modifications to the rule, especially the Advanced Clean Fleet rule. And I do think the current incentives are going to continue. The multi-year tax incentive, I think, is absolutely critical to get additional players into the game, and then also to make investments or modifications to your feedstocks or whatever choices are out there.
And I think, I wanted to add one other thing. Marine is sort of the one thing that's not addressed. And when I think about, these disadvantaged communities, California, a huge, I can't remember the percentage, but it's something like, I think, a quarter or a third of all imported goods come in through the West Coast. And if you think about the West Coast, right, they're all LCFS type programs from Washington now through California. But Oregon and Washington dovetail and follow California virtually, verbatim in lockstep. And when I think about marine and those disadvantaged communities, those ports, yeah, there's some rules about what type of fuel you have to burn when you're docked and all, but at the end of the day, LCFS, I think, needs to look at making marine an opt-in. And I'm talking about displacing bunker fuel, because marine is going to be a very difficult sector to decarbonize and to clean that up. When you think about bunker fuel being burned, even when it's 250 miles offshore, wind blows typically from west to east, right? That emission profile from bunker fuel burning offshore hits California and the West Coast.
Okay. I'll just say,
Can I follow up real quick?
real quick.
Okay, so, sorry. 2 points real quick. So I like to view the coming months and years as an opportunity. I think CARB, to their credit, and while we disagree on the outcome of the cap and the sustainability, I think they introduced in the last rulemaking the concept of a high risk versus low, which implies a low risk region. And I think exploring that a little bit more with CARB and getting those nuances down with the science, I think will help address the sort of deforestation challenges and other sort of challenges that CARB address. And I would prefer to see a scalpel applied to that sort of concern rather than the mallet, I think, that the regulation applied. The second thing is, I went through climate and clean air. There is another slide I won't go through, but the third C that I view this as driving California is cost, and more specifically affordability. I think Politico called this the year of affordability, and I think you heard that if you saw the rulemaking. It's a key issue with this sort of program and other programs in California, and that's where our fuels really provide an important role. As I mentioned, we're at cost parity, or even in the case of biodiesel, cost advantage relative to fossil diesel. So I think that would play an important role for the program.
Great. So I think the last parting thing is it's not all bad, folks. There's a lot of opportunity here in California. We still need the fuels. CARB is not an easy department to work with, but we continue to engage, and there's still brighter things to come. So I want to thank our panelists for being up here and giving us your expertise. That's it for our panel here.
Hey, I thought that was a great panel, exactly what we were hoping for, a great conversation about what's happening out here in California, our biggest state. So thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate you very much. One more round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Harry. Appreciate it. So please stay seated. Just a couple more minutes. The Clean Fuels Awards recognizes industry leaders and champions for their outstanding efforts in advancing biodiesel, renewable diesel, and sustainable aviation fuel. In an industry that is rapidly changing with unprecedented growth, it takes strong leadership to ensure success. So we have 2 awards to present this morning, and we are proud to acknowledge this year's recipients for their vision that continues to drive demand for cleaner fuels. The first award is the Initiative Award. This year's Initiative Award goes to the California Advanced Biofuels Alliance. CABA has been a long-term strategic partner in helping drive biomass-based diesel use along the entire West Coast. As the primary advocate for biodiesel and renewable diesel producers, manufacturers in the region, CABA actively supports initiatives such as the LCFS that position California as the leading market for clean fuels. The Initiative Award recognizes CABA's meaningful collaboration among industry stakeholders, ensuring that clean fuels remains a competitive and viable solution for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector. Thanks to CABA's impactful and educational marketing and policy initiatives, California continues to be a pivotal market for our industry. So please welcome back to the stage to accept this award, Carlos Gutierrez. All right, there you go. We're going to get our picture taken right here. Yeah.
I just want to say thank you, of course, to Clean Fuels, and of course to our member companies that are here in the audience. Our association started a long time ago, and I'm not sure if we ever had the vision of engaging on all fronts, both political, legislatively, and regulatory. So thank you to them, and of course, thank you to our partners. We really appreciate it. We'll continue to engage, and for any of you who want to join our association, I'm shamelessly going to make the pitch. Come join us. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Carlos. CABA's actually been at it since 2006. So they've been working hard for a long time here on behalf of all of you in California. Our next award is a special one. It's our prestigious Lifetime Achievement Award. And there's no point in trying to keep you in suspense on this one. On behalf of our industry, it's my pleasure to announce that our Lifetime Achievement Award goes to Floyd Vergara. We want to recognize Floyd. We want to recognize Floyd for his transformative contributions to the clean fuels industry and environmental policy. As one of the chief architects of the low-carbon fuel standard, Floyd played a pivotal role in shaping one of the most impactful climate policies in our nation's history during his time at CARB. The LCF has revolutionized environmental outcomes. And as you know, we eventually hired Floyd away from CARB. He ended his career on another high note, leading our state affairs team until 2023. He successfully elevated state-level initiatives as a cornerstone of market growth for our industry. His enduring legacy is a testament to the power of forward-thinking policy to spur transformation and progress. So please join me in this very well-deserved recognition of Floyd Vergara. Thanks, man.
Appreciate it.
Love you.
Love you too.
Here you go.
Thanks.
Right here, let's take a picture.
Just a few more words, patience. Thank you, Donnell. I really appreciate this. Every time I see these Lifetime Achievement Awards, it's always been either posthumously or person has a terminal condition of some sort. So I hope you don't know something that I don't. You haven't been talking to my doctor?
No.
Okay. Just seriously, it has been the singular honor of my life to end my career with Clean Fuels. As many of you know, I have been a believer in an all-of-the-above strategy, and biofuels came into my, my responsibility at CARB at an early stage. I understood the benefits of that, particularly looking forward with respect to the kind of longer-term technologies. I still believe that, and so it has been a pleasure for me to work with this industry, especially our farmer producers and also our biofuel producers. And under the fantastic leadership from Donnell and the team, very strong team, as you heard him say at Clean Fuels, we look forward to continuing that. My socks say I'm retired, it's no longer my problem. But I woke up this morning realizing climate change still is my problem. And so I'm happy to provide a continuing support to Clean Fuels in this industry. So thank you very much.
Thanks, man.
Thanks.
Thank you. What a guy. So before we take our morning break here in Conference Center, I wanted to remind you to check out the annual Clean Fuels Foundation auction table at our booth in the back. It raises money for some valuable education events that Clean Fuels and Clean Fuels Foundation can host. So San Diego is Top Gun country. You can get an original Top Gun film strip movie poster display with the stars' autographs. Or how about some framed autographed sheet music? And our good friend and biodiesel pioneer, Jim Evanhoff, who's retired from the National Park Service, but he has offered up a VIP tour of Yellowstone National Park. And also, we have 10 copies of The Mysterious Case of Rudolph Diesel, signed by the author. So take one of those home. I told you a little bit about the story. You won't regret it. And so a big thank you to everyone who sponsors this conference, and especially our champion sponsors. So I'll see you back on the main stage after lunch and wish each and every one of you a great morning. Go out and have some fun. Let's go. Thank you.